The Galactic Dominion had ruled the known stars for over 40,000 years. It had swallowed civilizations whole, mapped the edges of the galaxy, and cataloged every species worth cataloging. And in all that time, it had never once been wrong about a new world. Not once. The Dominion was built on certainty. Certainty about its own strength, certainty about its own superiority, and most importantly, our certainty about its ability to look at any new species and know exactly what that species was worth. This certainty had served the Dominion well across 40 millennia, and there was no reason, as far as anyone inside its vast halls of power was concerned, to question it now. At the very top of the Dominion's long and carefully ordered hierarchy sat the Scythery, tall, pale beings with 4 silver eyes and a natural lifespan of nearly 3,000 years. They had discovered faster-than-light travel before most other species had discovered agriculture, and they wore this fact the way others wore fine clothing, permanently and without ever thinking about it. Below the Scythery sat dozens of other powerful races, each one ranked and sorted according to their usefulness, their firepower, or their value as workers, soldiers, or sources of raw material. Below all of them, in the vast, unvisited dark at the edges of the Orion Arm, sat the rest. The small worlds, the young civilizations, the species that had not yet been found or had not yet been worth finding. Earth was one of those worlds. The probe that first scanned the Sol system was a standard long-range unit. It swept through, collected data, flagged the planet as biologically active, and fired its findings back toward Dominion space. The signal took 3 years to arrive, and when it did, it was sorted automatically into a queue that already contained data from 942 other low-priority worlds. It sat there for 6 years before anyone looked at it. The person who finally opened the file was Archon Vethkal. He was the Dominion's most decorated xenobiologist, or a Scythery of considerable reputation who had formally classified more alien species than any other living scientist in the Dominion. He had a reputation for being thorough, precise, and completely without sentiment, which was considered a virtue in his field. He read the Earth file on a quiet afternoon when nothing else was pressing. The planet was small, roughly 12,000 kilometers across, orbiting a Class G yellow star in the 3rd position. It had liquid water covering most of its surface, and an oxygen-rich atmosphere that indicated complex biological life. So far, unremarkable, the dominant species was bipedal, warm-blooded, and soft. They had no natural armor, no venom, no regenerative ability, no claws worth mentioning. They were physically weak by galactic standards, with a maximum natural lifespan of roughly 100 years. See which Vethkal considered barely enough time to become truly useful at anything. They slept for a third of every single day. This detail made him pause and read it twice. Not in the kind of controlled recovery state that Dominion soldiers used, not in a meditative trance. They simply went unconscious every night for hours at a time, completely helpless and unaware, and had apparently been doing this for their entire evolutionary history. They communicated by pushing air through a hole in their face. They had no psionic ability and no hive mind connection. Every single human appeared to operate as a completely separate individual with its own thoughts, its own goals, and its own opinions about everything. There were over 7 billion of them crammed onto one planet, and they could not agree with each other on basic matters of governance. They had hundreds of separate governments, thousands of different languages, and were currently engaged in dozens of simultaneous small wars with each other over territory, resources, and a baffling variety of conflicting beliefs. Vethkal set the file down and considered it for a moment. Then he picked up his writing instrument and composed his official report in under an hour. Species designation: marginal, threat level, negligible. Recommended action: standard subjugation protocol. He submitted it and moved on to the next file without a second thought. The Galactic Council reviewed his recommendation 4 weeks later. I'm slotted between a proposal to increase mining operations in the Keth Belt and a long discussion about commercial trade routes near the Outer Arm. Humanity's fate was item 7 on a 12-item agenda. The Council debated for 8 minutes, asked 2 clarifying questions, and voted. The result was unanimous. Standard subjugation protocol was approved. Fleet assignment was logged the same afternoon. The 3rd Fleet was chosen for the mission. 400 warships, you enough firepower to level continents, commanded by High Admiral Zoran. Zoran was a careful, experienced officer who had completed 17 subjugation campaigns without a single significant complication. He was not chosen because this mission was considered important. He was chosen because he was reliable, and reliability was all this mission was expected to need. He reviewed the Earth file during the 11 months of travel to the Sol system, read it twice, found nothing that surprised him, and filed it away. His second-in-command asked once whether he thought there would be any serious resistance to prepare for. Zoran thought about it briefly. "They are still fighting each other," he said. "Ray, a species that cannot stop fighting itself cannot fight us." His second-in-command nodded and said nothing more about it. What neither of them stopped to examine, what no one in the Dominion had thought to look for, was a single pattern buried deep in the raw probe data, flagged as irrelevant by the automated sorting system and never reviewed by any living analyst. Across thousands of years of recorded human history, across hundreds of different wars and conflicts, the pattern appeared again and again without exception. When an external threat arrived, when something from outside came for them, the internal fighting stopped. Not always immediately, not always completely, but it always stopped. The fleet crossed into the Sol system on a cold morning in Earth's late autumn, and the blue planet hung in the darkness ahead of them. Quiet, bright, and impossibly small against the scale of the fleet surrounding it. Zoran looked at it on his forward display and felt nothing in particular. He had seen hundreds of worlds just like it. He ordered the standard ultimatum broadcast and leaned back in his command chair to wait. The message went out in 217 human languages, clear and simple and absolute. Submit to the authority of the Galactic Dominion, or face the consequences. On the planet below, 7 billion humans looked up, listened to the message, and went very, very quiet. They were not afraid. They were thinking. The 72 hours of silence from Earth were not what Zoran had expected. He had done this 17 times before, walked a fleet to a new world, broadcast the ultimatum, and waited. Most species responded within hours. Some begged, some tried to negotiate. A few sent angry transmissions full of threats that Zoran's weapons could reduce to silence in under a minute. But 72 hours of complete silence was unusual, and unusual things always deserved a second look. His communications officer tracked everything coming off the planet during those 3 days. The volume of radio signals had tripled, military satellites were shifting orbits, ground-based radar arrays that had been pointed at the sky for decades were suddenly running at full capacity. The planet was not quiet in any real sense. It was doing something busy and organized and difficult to read. But no formal response came through any channel. When the 72 hours expired, Zoran ordered the first strike wave. It was a limited strike. He carefully calibrated. 12 precision bombardments aimed at military installations across 3 continents. A show of force designed not to destroy but to demonstrate. A message delivered in fire that said, "We are serious and you cannot stop us." It was the standard second step of every subjugation campaign the Dominion had ever run, and it had never failed to produce a formal response within hours. The response came, but it was not what he expected. Instead of a broadcast, Earth launched, not a full counterattack. The humans had nothing capable of threatening Zoran's fleet in a direct engagement, and they clearly understood this. What they launched was a wave of objects that briefly confused the fleet's targeting systems before being classified as a mix of conventional missiles, drones, standard explosive warheads, and a very large number of what appeared to be sensor packages, small, cheap, expendable things packed with recording equipment and short-range transmission arrays. They were not trying to win the exchange. They were trying to learn from it. Every object that reached within range of the Dominion fleet before being destroyed managed to transmit data back to the surface. Shield frequencies, weapon discharge signatures, engine drive patterns, hull material readings wherever the sensors got close enough. The humans were running a live technical analysis of the most powerful fleet they had ever encountered while that fleet was actively shooting at them. Zoran watched the engagement data and felt a creeping unease that he could not quite explain to himself. "They know they cannot hurt us," his tactical officer said, watching the readouts. Then what are they doing? Zoran asked. Nobody had a clean answer. On the surface, the answer was actually quite simple. Humanity was doing what it had always done when it faced something it did not yet understand. It was taking notes. In underground facilities, in university basements converted overnight, in factories retooled in 48 hours, and in server rooms spread across every continent, teams of engineers, physicists, weapons designers, art and mathematicians were processing the incoming sensor data as fast as it arrived. Language was no barrier. The data was being shared across networks that had been quietly linked in the days before the fleet's arrival. People who had been political enemies for generations sat at screens side by side and did not speak to each other except about numbers. Within 2 days of the first exchange, humanity already had partial working models of Dominion shield harmonic frequencies and a rough understanding of the weapon discharge cycle. They could not yet do anything with this information, but they were building toward the day when they could, and they were building fast. The ground forces arrived 3 weeks after the opening strikes. Zoran deployed them across 3 continents simultaneously, targeting major population centers and critical infrastructure. The landings were efficient, and the initial resistance was predictable. Human conventional weapons were effective against soft targets, but could not reliably penetrate standard Dominion personal armor, and the occupation forces advanced on schedule through every major objective. It was only when they pushed beyond the cities that things began to feel strange. There were no refugees in the traditional sense. People were moving, yes, but they were not running in panic. They were relocating in organized groups, carrying specific equipment, and traveling toward specific destinations that appeared on no map the Dominion had cataloged. Supply lines that had not existed a month ago were already operational, maintained by civilians who had never worn a uniform. Communication networks that should have been knocked out in the initial strikes were still functioning because they had already been rebuilt using materials that matched no known communication standard. The humans were using salvaged Dominion wreckage to do it. A field commander named Preth filed a report noting that a resistance cell in the northern continent had disabled 2 Dominion armored vehicles using a device that appeared to be constructed partly from components recovered from a Dominion drone shot down 11 days prior. 11 days. Preth flagged the note and moved on, because there were 100 other things demanding attention. He did not stop to consider what the timeline meant, that 11 days was the gap between a human engineer seeing a piece of Dominion technology for the very first time and building a working countermeasure from its wreckage. Imperfect, inelegant, assembled from mismatched parts, but working, Zoran's science officer, a quiet Sci-Fi researcher named Kess, began keeping a private log of the adaptation incidents appearing in field reports. She did not file it officially because she was not yet sure what to make of what she was seeing. But she noted that the resistance was not behaving the way resistance normally behaved. Usually, resistance decayed. First contact was the most intense phase, and then the fight slowly drained out of people as casualties mounted, supplies ran dry, and hope eroded under the weight of an unwinnable situation. Human resistance was not decaying. It was growing. New cells formed every week, not remnants of the original military holding out, but fresh groups built from civilians with no formal training who were learning how to fight as they went. They made mistakes, they took heavy losses, and they did not stop. And each group, somehow, was passing what it learned to every other group: knowledge of Dominion tactics, identified weaknesses, solutions to problems they had encountered and survived. Humanity was learning collectively, in real time, under live enemy fire. And the rate was getting faster rather than slower. Kess wrote in her private log, "I am watching something that I have no category for. They are not advancing the way a trained military advances. They are advancing the way a living system adapts to pressure. Each point of contact generates information that strengthens every other point. They are individually slower than us in almost every measurable way, and yet somehow they are faster than us at this specific thing." She paused over the entry for a long time. Then she added one more line. "I think we have made a serious error." Zoran's official report to the Galactic Council at the end of the 3rd month was calm and measured. Casualties were within acceptable parameters. Major urban centers were under control. The ongoing resistance was significant in certain sectors, but not strategically threatening. What he did not include in the report was Kess's log. What he did not include was the adaptation timeline. What he did not include was the quiet feeling that had started following him through the corridors of his ship at night. A feeling he had no name for. How that sat at the back of his thoughts and would not go away regardless of how many times he reviewed the numbers and confirmed that the numbers all said he was winning. It felt, if he was being honest with himself, like the first edge of concern. 3 years into the occupation of Earth, the Galactic Dominion controlled the sky, the sea lanes, and most of the planet's major cities. By every number that had ever mattered in any previous subjugation campaign, the war should already be over. It was not over. The resistance had not shrunk in 3 years. It had grown. The Dominion now controlled the surface the way a hand controls water, which is to say imperfectly, with constant effort, and with the quiet and growing awareness that the water was always finding new paths. Human resistance cells were small, scattered, constantly moving, and they communicated through methods that changed frequently enough to make interception unreliable. They did not hold ground the way conventional armies held ground. They existed in the spaces between the Dominion's reach and kept pulling the edges of that reach apart from the inside. But the growing resistance was not what kept Zoran awake during the long, dark hours of the ship's night cycle. It was the weapons. 3 years ago, the humans had been fighting with conventional projectile arms, homemade explosives, and a handful of crude devices built from salvaged Dominion wreckage. Unusual, yes, but within the range of what the occupation force was fully equipped to handle. Now, the weapons appearing in field reports looked like nothing the Dominion had in any of its catalogs. They were ugly. Every Dominion engineer who examined recovered examples said so immediately, and without hesitation. They were dense and asymmetric and clearly built from whatever materials had been available rather than from any rational design process that a Dominion engineer would recognize. But they functioned. And in certain specific categories, they functioned better than they had any right to. A weapon recovered in the eastern continent. Theater had a shield penetration capability that Kess's analysis indicated should not have been physically achievable, given the materials it had been constructed from. She ran the calculations 3 times and got the same result each time. Then she stopped running the calculations and sat with it quietly for a while. The humans had not simply copied Dominion on technology. They had looked at it, understood the principles driving it, and then built their own version using those principles without the original materials, without the original manufacturing methods, and in some specific ways had ended up with a result that outperformed the original. They had been working with these principles for 3 years, and every month the gap between what they were building and what the Dominion had been building for centuries was narrowing. Kess filed a full formal report this time. She did not keep it private. She sent it directly to Zoran and marked it at the highest priority level available to her. Her conclusion was 3 sentences long. Human. Technological adaptation is not following a normal learning curve. It is accelerating. At the current rate. Within 18 months, their weapons development will reach functional parity with standard Dominion infantry equipment in the categories of shield penetration and personal armor defeat. Zoran read the report twice, then a third time. Then he forwarded it to the council without comment, because he had no comment that felt adequate. But the weapons were only the second most unsettling development on Earth. The first was the music. Nobody knew exactly when it had started or who had done it first. The theory among Dominion intelligence analysts was that it had been a deliberate soft warfare tactic, planned and executed with strategic intent. Some of the same analysts privately doubted that any species could have organized something this precise while simultaneously running an active armed resistance against an occupying fleet. But they had no better explanation, so the theory stood. Somehow, human cultural content was moving through the Dominion's communication networks, not the military networks. Those were hardened and regularly swept. But the civilian and commercial networks connecting client species across Dominion-controlled space were being quietly and persistently reached. A piece of music here, a visual story there, a collection of recorded histories from a world that was currently under armed occupation. Whoever was doing it understood enough about Dominion network architecture to move through it without triggering automated detection. And they had clearly been doing it for a long time before anyone noticed. The problem, from the Dominion's perspective, was not the infiltration itself. The problem was that people across the Dominion were watching, listening, And not stopping. The Velmari were the first species flagged as a concern. They were a gentle, long-lived race that had been a client civilization of the Dominion for 600 years. I'm valued for their engineering precision and their historically absolute reliability as a labor force. They had never organized resistance of any kind. They were not the type. But Velmari individuals in 3 different Dominion sectors had been found distributing human cultural materials. A Velmari engineer aboard a Dominion warship had 200 hours of human music stored on a personal device. When questioned by security officers, she said she did not fully understand why she kept returning to it. She said it produced something in her that she did not have a word for in her own language. She used a human word instead. She used the word hope. The intelligence officer who filed this report noted it with visible discomfort. The humans are not only fighting with weapons, they are fighting with the image of themselves. And that image is reaching species who have no direct connection to this conflict and no practical reason to be moved by it. On the occupied surface, on a pattern that Preth had flagged once, in month 7, finally reached a level in month 30 that could no longer be treated as a minor anomaly. Velmari soldiers assigned to Dominion occupation units in the Southern Continent Theater had begun refusing orders to engage human civilian populations. Not many. Not enough to collapse a unit. But the number was not stable. It was growing. Preth reassigned them away from frontline positions and filed a detailed report. The final line of that report was one that his commanding officer read 4 times before deciding it was real. I believe the humans are converting our allied personnel simply by existing in their presence. Zoran gathered Kess and his 2 senior tactical officers in a private briefing room and closed the door. He laid all of it out. The weapons reports, the cultural infiltration data, the Velmari defection numbers, the adaptation curve that Kess had charted and that showed no signs of flattening. "Tell me how this ends," he said. Kess was quiet for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I believe," she said carefully, "that we need to return to the Council and request a considerably larger fleet." "And if we do that," Zoran said, "we are telling the Council that the 3rd Fleet was not enough, for a species they classified as negligible, in an 8-minute vote." No one said anything for a long moment. "Yes," Kess said, "that is what we would be telling them." Zoran stood and looked out the viewport at the planet turning slowly below, green and blue and pale white at the poles, bright against the surrounding dark, still producing light on the night side. It is still full of radio signals and movement and the persistent noise of a civilization that had been under occupation for 3 years and had not gone quiet. He thought about Vethkal's report. Threat level. Negligible. He thought about the 8-minute vote. He thought about being handed this mission like a routine errand, given the 3rd Fleet instead of the 1st because no one considered this world worth the 1st. And standing at that viewport in the quiet of the command ship, the High Admiral Zoran felt something settle over him that he recognized immediately because it was a feeling every soldier knows. The feeling of understanding. Too late. Exactly where you are and what is standing in front of you. He had not been sent to subjugate a weak world. He had been sent to challenge something that the Dominion had never encountered in 40,000 years of conquest. He just hadn't known it when he arrived. The 2nd Fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system 14 months after Zoran sent his request. It was nothing like the 3rd Fleet. This was not a courtesy force assembled for a routine task. This was 4 times the size of Zoran's entire command, carrying warship classes that had not been deployed in active combat in over 200 years. Among them were 3 Extinction-class dreadnoughts, weapons that the Dominion had not used since the Keth Rebellion, the kind that did not subdue civilizations but ended them, permanently and completely and without the possibility of appeal. The Council's attached message to Zoran was brief, and its tone left no room for interpretation. "The situation on Earth has become an embarrassment. Resolve it." Zoran read the message once and set it aside without responding. He had not told the Council everything. Not from disloyalty, but because there were things he had watched over 5 years on this mission that he could not adequately explain in a report. And things he could explain that he knew the Council would dismiss as the field commander, overcomplicating a simple problem. The acceleration of human weapons development, the Velmari defections, The way the resistance had grown more effective every single month instead of less. He had told them enough to justify the request. What he had not said was the thing he had been thinking about in the quiet hours. That he was no longer certain a larger fleet would change the outcome. He had not said it because he was not yet fully sure he believed it himself. The Second Fleet's commander was High Marshal Drav. Older than Zoran, harder-edged, with a service record that included the suppression of two serious internal Dominion revolts and the pacification of the Marathi border worlds a century ago. Drav was not the kind of person who lost sleep over field reports from junior officers. He reviewed Zoran's data during the long transit to the Sol system. And when they met aboard the flagship, he delivered his assessment with the confidence of a person who had never been wrong about anything important. "You overcomplicated it," Drav said. You gave them time. You should have struck harder in the first month and never let them breathe." Zoran did not argue. There was no useful purpose in arguing with Drav. But he noted privately that this analysis depended entirely on the assumption that heavier pressure in the first month would have broken human resistance. And he was no longer confident that assumption held. What neither of them knew yet was what had been happening on Earth during the 14 months between Zoran's request and Drav's arrival. Those 14 months had been the most important in human history. The humans had understood early that more was coming. They had intercepted enough fragments of Dominion communication to grasp the scale of what was being prepared, even without being able to read the specific content, and they had used every day of those 14 months the way they had always used time when they were cornered. They had built, deep in the asteroid belt, in caverns carved into rock more than 500 million kilometers from Earth, human engineers had been working for over 2 years on a project most of them had never expected to complete in time. 12 warships. The first genuine combat vessels humanity had ever constructed. Not armed transports, not planetary defense platforms, but warships designed from the beginning with a single purpose: to fight Dominion technology in open space. They were not beautiful. Dominion engineers who examined the wreckage after the battle would describe them in terms that translated roughly as architecturally offensive. They were dense and irregular, and clearly designed by people who were learning what a warship needed to be while they were building it. But they were fast. They were well armed with weapons specifically engineered against the shield frequencies Kess had mapped years ago. And they were crewed by people who had spent 5 years watching their world be occupied, and who were prepared, in a way that changes a person permanently, to spend themselves completely in a single fight if that was what the fight required. The Velmari were ready as well. What had begun as individual soldiers quietly refusing to fire had grown across 3 years into something much larger and much more organized. Across 3 Dominion sectors, Velmari engineers, soldiers, and ship crews had been preparing carefully for a moment they had started to believe might actually arrive. A moment when something cracked in the Dominion's certainty and left a gap wide enough to act through. They had hidden supplies. They had ships whose loyalty logs had been carefully falsified over many months. And they had been in quiet contact with 2 other client species who had their own long-held grievances against the great order of things. None of this appeared in any report that reached Drav's desk. The Battle of the Oort Cloud began when Drav's fleet crossed into the outer solar system and encountered resistance where no resistance had any right to exist. The 12 human ships hit the fleet's forward line at an approach angle that Dominion tactical doctrine classified as irrational. It was a high-exposure vector with no retreat path, the kind of attack that any experienced military mind looked at and identified immediately as a strike by people who did not expect to survive it. It was not a suicide run. It was a distraction. While Drav's forward screen turned to engage the human ships, the Velmari vessels embedded through the fleet's rear ranks opened fire on their neighbors. Not in panic, not at random, but in a precise, coordinated pattern that had clearly been rehearsed, targeting sensor arrays, communication systems, and drive mechanisms. The intent was not to destroy ships outright, but to degrade the fleet's ability to coordinate. To make it blind and slow and unable to respond to more than one problem at once. Then the other 2 client species made their move. Drav spent 12 seconds watching his tactical display transform from a straightforward suppression campaign into something that had no name anywhere in Dominion military history. A full fleet mutiny, a coordinated ambush, and a conventional battle happening simultaneously. Now, with the conventional engagement being the smallest of the 3, how, he said, quietly, to no one. Just the single word. The battle lasted 9 hours. The Dominion fleet was too large to be destroyed completely, and the combined human and allied forces were too small to achieve a total victory in a single engagement. But the 3 Extinction-class dreadnoughts never fired their primary weapons, because they were boarded before Drav could issue the authorization codes. The boarding parties moved through maintenance corridors that no Dominion security briefing had ever flagged as a vulnerability. They had apparently been studying the ship's internal schematics for well over a year, using data recovered from 2 previous wreckages. They wore mismatched armor over standard pressure suits and carried weapons that looked as though they had been assembled from parts of 3 or 4, or entirely different things. They moved through the corridors of the most powerful warships in the known galaxy, with a quiet, focused intensity that the ship's defenders found deeply unsettling. They did not storm the ships, they navigated them. They went directly to the places that mattered and took control of them while the battle outside kept everyone else occupied. When the bridge doors of Drav's flagship opened and the first human soldiers stepped through, Zoran was standing near the rear of the command center, pulled from his own ship for a tactical briefing that had been overtaken by events. He stood and watched Drav look at the soldiers filling the doorway. Drav looked at them for a long moment. Their mismatched armor, their young faces, the absolute settled certainty in the way they held their positions with weapons raised. He looked at the tactical display, which showed his fleet fractured across 400,000 kilometers. His flagship compromised, and the extinction weapons locked and inaccessible behind codes that were now in human hands. Then he looked at Zoran. Zoran met his eyes and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Drav turned back to the humans at the door and was quiet for a moment. "We should have paid attention," he said. It was the last thing he said as a free man. The Galactic Dominion did not fall the day the battle ended. Empires as old and large as the Dominion do not fall in a single day. They are too deep, too spread, too woven into the fabric of too many worlds to simply collapse because one fleet lost a battle, even a battle as significant as the one fought at the edge of the Sol system. The Dominion had survived revolts before, survived political crises, survived the loss of worlds. It was built to survive things. But something had cracked, and everyone who was paying attention could feel it. The Council had known for years that the client species were unhappy. They were always unhappy. And that was simply the nature of subjugation. But unhappy species with the full weight of Dominion military power pressing down on them from above were a very different thing from unhappy species who had just watched a primitive world resist that military power for 5 years and then win a battle that should not have been winnable. The math changed when the impossible became visible to everyone at once. In the 6 weeks following the Battle of the Oort Cloud, formal petitions for treaty renegotiation arrived from 14 client species. Not open revolts, not yet, but the kind of carefully worded official documents that said, "We are watching and we believe the situation has fundamentally changed." The Velmari, who had been the first to openly break from the Dominion fleet, issued a statement that was read in every major council chamber and translated into 217 languages. It said, among other things, that they had chosen their side with full understanding of what that choice meant, and that they stood by it without reservation. The Dominion Council met in emergency session. The tone in that chamber, according to the few records that survived reclassification, was unlike any session in living memory. For the first time in longer than any sitting member could personally recall, there was something present that had not been there before. There was uncertainty. On Earth, the debate was loud and messy and went on for months, which was not surprising for a species that processed everything by arguing about it first and deciding second. The questions were large and the stakes were larger. What to do with the captured Dominion fleet? What to do with the extinction-class weapons now in human hands? And most pressingly, what to do with the council members and commanders who had ordered the occupation of Earth and the deaths of the people who had lived through it? Some voices argued for an immediate counter-campaign. March the fleet to the Dominion's core worlds. Push the advantage while the window was open. You reshape the galaxy on terms that no one could challenge for a generation. These voices were loud and found an audience among populations who had spent 5 years watching their cities be destroyed and their people die under an occupation ordered by beings who had voted on their fate in 8 minutes. Other voices argued for withdrawal. Bring the fleet home. fortify the solar system. You demand formal recognition of human sovereignty and leave the politics of the wider galaxy to itself. These voices also had support, and from people who were simply exhausted and wanted the fighting to be finished. But the voices that ultimately shaped policy were neither the loudest nor the most tired. They were the voices that kept asking a different question. Not, what can we take? And not, how do we protect ourselves? But, what kind of thing do we want to be? The Dominion had looked at humanity and seen either a resource or a threat. Two categories, both defined entirely by what humanity could provide or what it might do to you. This framing had served the Dominion for 40,000 years of expansion and had ultimately led it to this exact moment, to a battle it had never imagined losing, started by an 8-minute vote on a world they had never visited. Humanity chose a different way of looking at things. The extinction-class weapons were destroyed, publicly, in a broadcast carried on every available frequency, with official observers from 40 civilizations attending in person. No ceremony, no long speeches, or no performance of righteousness. The weapons were disassembled and the core components rendered permanently inert while the galaxy watched. The broadcast lasted 3 hours and was observed by more beings than any single event in recorded galactic history. The captured Dominion fleet was not kept by humanity. The warships were divided among the client species who had fought in the battle and the species whose petitions for renegotiation had been assessed as legitimate, not given as gifts, are not sold for advantage but transferred, as the human representatives stated plainly, to the people who had the most practical and historical reason to need them. This decision was not universally popular among human populations, and the debate around it was fierce and long, but the decision held. The trials were the most watched proceedings in the post-war period. 17 senior Dominion military commanders and 9 council members faced formal hearings, held in an orbital station above Earth that belonged to no single nation and could be seen from the planet's surface on clear nights. The proceedings were completely open. Every session was broadcast without restriction. Every piece of evidence was part of the public record. Every question put to every defendant was asked in front of official witnesses from 50 civilizations. Zoran was not among the defendants. He had filed an internal report 4 years into the occupation, noting the adaptation anomalies he and Kess had documented. Also, a report the council had received and chosen to ignore. This fact was entered into the record and considered in the assessment of his conduct. He was released without charges and spent the following decade writing a detailed account of everything he had witnessed from the first day of the mission to the last, which became one of the most widely read documents of the period historians would later call the transition. Archon Vethkal was among the defendants. He was old now, older than when he had written the report that set all of this in motion, worn down in ways that had nothing to do with physical age. He sat in the defendant's chair in the orbital station and looked across the chamber with the eyes of a person who had spent most of his long life believing he understood the universe and was now living in the wreckage of that belief. The lead judge was a woman named Sarah Okafor. She had grown up in a city that no longer existed, had lost people she loved in the first year of the occupation, and had spent 3 of the 5 years of the war operating with a resistance cell in the mountains of her continent before the fighting ended. She had been chosen for the tribunal not because she was impartial. No living human was impartial about this. But because she was known, above everything else, for being precise. She looked at Vethkal for a long time before she spoke. When she did, "You looked at us and saw nothing worth fearing," she said. "That was your first mistake. You attacked us anyway. That was your last. You will live, Archon, and you will watch what we build. And you will spend the remainder of your very long life with the full knowledge that the greatest error the Dominion ever made began with 8 minutes of your certainty and ended here." Vethkal received a sentence of supervised observation. He was required to remain in accessible space and to attend, as a named witness, every major construction project, every new treaty signing, and every formal expansion of the new galactic arrangement that was slowly and messily replacing the old one. He lived for another 900 years. He attended everything. He never filed another classification report. In the sealed archives of the Galactic Council, buried under 3 levels of classification that no one had ever imagined would be challenged, a single entry was updated for the first time in 5 years. It was the original xenobiologist's report on Earth. Now covered in annotations, its classification changed from low priority to permanent reference. The final annotation was brief and unsigned, written in the dry, careful language of a bureaucratic system that had just been forced to learn something it should have understood from the beginning. Species designation, humanity, threat level. Do not classify. Recommended action. Do not challenge. Do not underestimate. Do not mistake the chaos of their disagreements for weakness. Do not mistake the shortness of their lives for poverty of purpose. Do not mistake their kindness for softness or their patience for surrender. Above, on all, do not mistake the silence before their storms for fear. They were never retreating. They were remembering how to fight,